Hello there and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle Emerson and I love helping teachers with all things technology, organization, and productivity. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing the top 10 teaching mistakes I have made throughout my career so that hopefully you don't have to make the same ones. Now, I have been documenting my life as a teacher on Instagram for almost 8 years and on YouTube for over 5. As you know, social media tends to be a highlight reel. And as humans, we love to compare ourselves to people. So that leaves us feeling like what we are doing is not enough, even though the reality is we all make mistakes. So today's video is meant to be vulnerable with you and show you that I'm nowhere near perfect and neither are you, and that's okay. Making mistakes is what helps us be able to learn and grow and become better versions of ourselves. So let's jump into it. But I would like to preface this by saying these 10 mistakes are not ranked. It's just a list of 10 mistakes that I know I've made. Mistake number 1 is I spent too much time working. When I think back to, especially within the first few years of my teaching career, there were nights where I was staying at school until 10, 11 p.m. I distinctly remember one night where the custodian came in my room and was like, "Hey, you gotta go because we're done cleaning and we have to lock up the school." And thinking back on it, I felt like I always had to be doing more, which meant I had to spend more and more time working. But over the years, I've realized it's not about doing more, it's just about prioritizing the tasks that you choose to complete. So a mistake within the mistake is that I never had boundaries. I would get home from work, even when I left at a decent hour, and I would spend several hours at home still working, which just led to me feeling very burnt out, which then meant I was not being the best teacher I could be for my students. I was exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally, all of the things. So for me, cutting back the amount of time I spent working forced me to really figure out what has to be done versus what would I like to have done, what's going to actually impact my instruction as a teacher, or what's just kind of like the icing on the cake that isn't fully necessary. During my, I think it was 6th year of teaching, I started working just contract hours. And that was a complete game changer in terms of my happiness. My stress levels were much lower and I felt like a better teacher because when I was in the classroom or online, I could give my full self to my students. Mistake number 2 is that I tried to do it all myself. I remember my first year of teaching, suddenly it was time to take my students to art, and I had no idea where the art room was because as a new teacher, I was too scared to ask anyone in the school for a tour. So I had to walk around aimlessly and hopefully find the art room. I went to where I thought the art room was, like it even said art outside, but nope. That room had been converted to a classroom and art was out in the portables. And it was a highly embarrassing situation. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. But I felt like I had to know it all. And now I've come to realize, even several years in, I still don't know it all. I never will know it all, and that's okay. Even veteran teachers who have been teaching for 30+ years are still learning, they're still growing, they still have questions. Now, within that, I also would have this really heavy workload, feeling like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You have so much to do, and I was never willing to ask for help. I would just try to find a way to get it all done, which, going back to the first mistake, just meant working excessive hours. But one of the biggest changes I started making was collaborating with my team teachers more, and that once again took off so much stress and made my responsibilities feel a lot more doable, if that makes sense. When I changed grade levels during my 4th year of teaching, one of the first things I started doing was collaborating with my team teacher who also taught math, and we would basically split up the lessons. So I would plan a week and I would share everything with her. She would plan a week and share everything with me. me, which meant I was really only lesson planning every other week. That was like a good stepping stone into reaching out and asking for help. After that, I started collaborating more with like science and social studies, and then I went on to teach reading, and I really depended on my team teachers for help because I had not taught reading for upper elementary, and it's a totally different ballgame than teaching reading in the primary grades. The more that I started asking for help and being willing to like split responsibilities with my team teachers, the more successful I felt because I didn't feel like I was being pulled in a million different directions. The third mistake is that I did not plan ahead. I remember my first year of teaching, I was literally planning everything the night before. I could never get ahead, and I would hear teachers talk about being planned a week or two in advance, and I could not grasp or wrap my brain around how that was even possible, because every single night I was just trying to plan what I was doing the next day. In fact, I remember doing a paleontology unit in science and driving to the dollar store at like 9 p.m. to get hats because I was only figuring out what I was doing for the next day. So one of the biggest changes I created for myself was actually establishing a planning routine. If my goal was to have the entire next week full of lesson plans done by Friday, I had to break up that work Monday through Friday in order to get it done. For me, batching is something that really helped me be more efficient with my time. So batching is completing similar tasks all at one time. I really enjoyed batching my lessons by the subject. So most years I taught 2 to 3 subjects, it just depended. Now again, I was upper elementary, we were departmentalized. I know that's not always the case for primary, but again, reach out to your team teachers for help. And I would, for example, plan out all of the math lessons on Monday and Tuesday. So maybe Monday I was coming up with that scope and sequence for my lessons, and I was deciding what activities I wanted to do, and then Tuesday I was maybe creating all of the slides that I would use to teach from. Then Wednesday, Thursday, I would plan all of my science lessons or all of my social studies, depending on what I was teaching that year. And then maybe Friday was all about making copies or getting caught up on grading. A lot of times I was able to have someone like a parent volunteer actually take care of my copies for me, or I started planning lessons that didn't need as many copies in order to take that off of my plate. If you are still convinced that the amount of planning you have to do cannot get done in the amount of time that you have, recruit help. Get parent volunteers, ask for help from your team teachers. Even if you don't have team teachers, partner up with another teacher in a school within your district that teaches the same grade level or the same subjects so that you can kind of alleviate some of that workload. The fourth mistake is that I planned my lessons forward instead of backward. What I mean by that is when I first started lesson planning, I would sit down, typically the night before, and I would first decide how I was going to intro the lesson, and then figure out what activity my students were gonna do, and then at the end, figure out some way to assess their learning. But the result of this was I wasn't teaching effectively. I would get to the end of the lesson and realize, ooh, my students really didn't even learn what they needed to learn based on this standard. So for me, switching to a backward style planning really allowed me to narrow in on what is the standard and what does that mean in kid-friendly language? Like, what do my students need to be able to do at the end of this lesson? From there, figuring out how am I going to assess that my students can actually do that? And then what activities do I need to plan leading up to that assessment so that my students can be successful? To me, this is a lot like setting goals or, establishing habits. If come January 1st, I'm like, hey, I really want to accomplish this in the next year, I have to kind of backwards plan it and figure out, okay, if I want this, I need to take steps Z, Y, X, W, V to, yeah, I'm going backwards in the alphabet because you really have to kind of think backwards. It's like, in order to do this, I first need to do this. So another thing that helped with that in terms of the backwards planning is a lot of times that objective was something more application based. So I want my students to take this skill and apply it to a real life situation. But in order to do that, they're going to need practice with the actual skill. So I would know that one of my last lessons would be application based. Before that, I would have some practice or like fluency based lessons. But then prior to that, my students need to actually learn the skill. So I would have something more like computation based, more mini lessons, things like that. So this backwards planning allowed me to better get my students from point A to point B. I don't know if I explained that well, but hopefully it makes sense. Mistake number 5 is that I was inconsistent. And I was inconsistent in pretty much every area of teaching. I was inconsistent with classroom management. I was inconsistent with my lesson planning style. I was inconsistent with tracking data. And I think a lot of this has to do with us always believing there's something better, right? It's that whole the grass is greener on the other side. And so we're always chasing something new when in reality, what we're doing could work if we just did it consistently. I feel like this is very similar to like different diets that people will go on. I use diet in quotation because technically a diet is just what you eat, but people are always chasing, oh, well, if I try this new trendy diet, it's gonna work better. Whereas pretty much any diet would work if you just did it consistently.
I can't go to Taco Bell. I'm on an all-carb diet.
If you're in a caloric deficit, but again, that gets complicated. Hopefully you understand the connection I'm trying to make. Within classroom management, I was always trying the new trendy thing that I saw on Instagram or Pinterest. And as a result, my students were confused because every other week I was changing whatever incentive system we were doing. And they were getting conflicting, information from me. In terms of my lesson planning, I started with a very basic paper lesson planner. And then it was, no, I need a fancy like Erin Condren planner. So I switched to that. And then it was, no, I want to try digital planning. And once I switched to digital planning, I was like, Michelle, you just gotta stick with it. And thankfully that was a style that I was able to stay consistent with. And again, that's during that time when I was able to actually get my lesson planning done ahead of time. And I think a lot of that is attributed to the fact that I was sticking with one lesson planning style and not trying to change it up every single week. Mistake number 6 is that I did not have a deep understanding of the content. Honestly, I don't know if this one is my fault. Not that I'm not trying to take ownership, but I strongly believe that college education programs do not prepare you for the realities of teaching. They focus a lot on different teaching methods or instructional methods or strategies that you can use, but they don't focus a lot on content. Now, I did have like an elementary math course and an elementary science course and all of those, but we never dove deep into actually understanding the content and understanding the standards and how they progress between grade levels. And I think this is especially a struggle for elementary teachers because you know how to do the skills, right? Like I know how to add, I know how to multiply, and as a result, you think that you can teach it. And you may be able to, but what I found is that even though I knew how to perform the skills, actually teaching that content in a way that's going to build off of what my students already know from the prior grade level and get them to have the knowledge and the skills that they need to be able to complete what they have to complete in the next grade level, right? Like it's a ladder, so getting them from one rung to the next. I did not have a deep understanding of how the skills progressed and what students should know at certain times and what prior knowledge they had to have in order to build on. I did not have a deep understanding of that. And it's difficult to admit because like that makes me feel like a failure of a teacher, right? That's literally my job, is to know the content. But it's important to recognize that I did not have that deep understanding so that I could take steps to fix it. And for me, that was a lot of PD, a lot of times on my own, not necessarily school-based PD, because I don't think schools give enough PD on the actual content, but that's another story for another day. One book that really helped me was called Making Sense of Mathematics. There is one for like primary grades, upper elementary, and there's also one for small groups. Highly recommend those books. I will link them down below. Obviously, for the past 4 years, I taught math primarily as my subject, so that's the area where I was doing the most growing. I'm sure there are other books similar for other subject areas, but I would not be the best person to recommend those. But another suggestion I can make is to spend as much time as possible collaborating with teachers, the grade level below you and the grade level above you, so that you have a better understanding of how those skills progress. I don't think schools give teachers enough time to do that type of planning so that they can have a better understanding, again, of how the skills are connected and what they need to do to better prepare students for the next grade. Mistake number 7 is I spent too much time leading instead of facilitating. Now, this is talking specifically about like my teaching style. When I first started teaching, I felt like I had to be the boss. I had to be the one imparting my wisdom and knowledge on my students. And over the years, I found that it was much better to really give the control to my students and just act as a facilitator within their learning. If you are spending a majority of the lesson talking or lecturing or teaching, which a lot of time really just means you're talking or lecturing, but okay, your students will end up being very disengaged because they are not actually a active learner. They're not a part of the lesson. And as a result, your students will not have as deep of an understanding of the content. So I started making small shifts that would allow my students to take more ownership over their learning. I specifically remember this one day where I was very overwhelmed. I was trying to plan my lesson for the next day, and I did not have the mental capacity to plan a lesson where I had to do a bulk of the teaching. So I decided, you know what? I'm gonna let my students create anchor charts. I'm gonna let them show everything they know on this topic, everything that they've learned so far on this particular strategy, and I'm gonna let them put it down on paper. I was amazed by how engaged my students were, by the anchor charts that they actually created. They were amazing. And it's because I gave my students control over their learning. Those super easy little fixes can make a huge difference in terms of student engagement and their retention of the content. I also started giving my students more control in our discussions. So especially in math, let's say I gave my students a problem and I wanted them just to kind of work through it as best as they could, kind of have that productive struggle. So it's difficult, but they can get there, if that makes sense. Rather than me going over the solution, I would pick out several students' answers and I'd put them under the document camera, I'd have them explain what they did, and I would just facilitate the discussion. So I would ask the class, can someone explain how so-and-so used this strategy, or how this strategy is connected to this other strategy? And it was my students really doing the teaching. They were teaching each other, I was just there facilitating it. And once again, that's going to lead to a deeper understanding when my students are the ones actually doing the teaching, and then they can learn from each other. There's just something about kids, if a child shows another kid in the class how to do something versus if I show them, they don't listen to me, but they will listen to, their friend who's showing them. Mistake number 8, I did not give specific feedback. Now again, this is in pretty much all areas of teaching. It was during independent work, it was during class discussions, it was during guided reading groups. I would hear a student give an answer and my response would be great answer, great job. But I wouldn't tell them what was great about it. And even more importantly, I wouldn't give them direction to continue to challenge themselves and continue to grow. So one of the big changes I started making is I would be very, very specific with what they did that was good, and then still giving them an area to grow. This is kind of like the glows and grows, what they did that glowed and then what they can still do to grow. So for example, if a student solved a math problem correctly using fraction towers, I wouldn't just say, great job. I would say something along the lines of, I love how you used fraction towers to model your thinking in a concrete way. Next time, I'd love to see you write an equation that matches your thinking. I'm highlighting what they did that was great. They used manipulatives and they were able to model their thinking, but I want to see them push themselves to also write an equation. I know sometimes it's difficult to come up with that area to grow, especially if everything they did was perfectly correct. But again, this goes back to having a better understanding of what's coming in the next grade level. For especially math, again, that's where my area of expertise was. I love to challenge my students to show their thinking with another strategy, because the more flexible they can be in their thinking, the better that's going to serve them as they move on to more complex skills. I also would invite them to come up with another problem that would have the same equation. So this was particularly true if we were working on word problems. They solve the word problem, they get it correct. Okay, can you come up with another problem that would have that same solution, that same equation? That would always get my students to think in a more creative way. Mistake number 9, I let pacing guides control my lessons. As teachers, we tend to feel a lot of pressure to continually be moving on because there's never enough time in the year. Especially now with everything going on, it's this pressure of I have to get my students caught up, whatever that means, because technically everyone has been behind, and those meters for being behind are really just things that we have imposed. But anyway, going on some tangents, I am sad to admit I would move my students on. Hello, lady.
Where's that light switch?
I would move my students on to a new lesson even if I knew they weren't fully ready for it, like they hadn't mastered the prior skill. And that's because, again, I felt that pressure. I had a document saying you need to be on this lesson on this day, otherwise you're behind and you're never gonna get caught up. But I realized this was not benefiting my students. And ultimately, that is my number one goal, right? That is what is most important to me, my students, and doing what is best for them. And even though, yes, I felt this pressure and I was almost worried of like getting in trouble if I wasn't where I needed to be, I realized that ultimately if someone came to me and said, you're behind, what's going on? If I can justify it by saying, I'm doing what's best for my students, who is going to argue with that? Ultimately, if they do argue with that, that's not a school I want to be at, because obviously we are not on the same page in terms of education. So once I switched my mindset to, I am going to do what's best for my students, I no longer felt that pressure because I knew that I was giving them what they needed, and that's all that mattered. And finally, mistake number 10, I made teaching my identity. This is probably the hardest one for me to admit. I wanted to be a teacher for so long. Like since I was in 2nd grade, I used to hold school for all the neighborhood kids on my front porch. I loved everything there was to love about teaching. And when I got into teaching, it was my dream career. Obviously, it was a lot harder than I ever anticipated, even though I heard that in college, right? Like you hear teaching is hard, and then you get into it and you're like, oh, now I understand. But because I was so passionate for it, I let it take over my life and I made it my everything. And I've already highlighted some of the ways in which I did that, the number of hours I spent and not having boundaries. And even though I felt like that was the best thing for me to do, I started to lose those other parts of me, because when you pour all of you into one area, it's like you create this mold of like, I can only be this. And once I started stepping back and allowing myself to pursue other passions, especially in the area of fitness or like business aspirations that I had, or even things as simple as just spending time with my friends and family, like being the girlfriend, the fiance, the wife that I wanted to be, I realized I was so much happier. And even though I still struggled with feeling guilty that I wasn't giving my all to teaching, I knew deep down that that was the best option for me. I was actually unhappy when I was pouring everything into teaching, even though I tried to convince myself that that was making me happy. So I've come to realize, teaching and education, it's a career. It's not my identity. I am a teacher, but I'm also an athlete. I'm also a wife. I'm also a daughter. I'm also, I wish I could say like artist or musician, but I'm not artsy or musically inclined, but I am all of these things outside of just teacher. That is one hat that I wear, but there's plenty more in my closet for me to try on, and I can even go get a new hat if I want, pick up a new hobby.
Yes! New hobby!
All right, that is it. Those are the top 10 teaching mistakes I have made. Hopefully some of this resonated with you and it's relatable to you, because I do think we struggle with a lot of the same things. People just don't talk about it as much as they should. But also hopefully you heard one or two things that maybe you didn't realize were mistakes that you're making, and maybe this can help you kind of avoid going down that same path that I went down. If you did identify with this video in any way or get some wisdom from it, please give it a thumbs up. I would love for you to share it out with your teacher friends, and if you have not already subscribed to my channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you do not miss any future videos. As always, thank you for watching. I love you all so much. Don't forget to put your positive pants on, and I will catch you in the next one.